It's great to be here. It's a joy to be able to visit in other dioceses and especially to spend some time with you this morning. The topic is faithful parenting in a culture of fear, but I hope that those of you who might not be parents are still edified by what we talk about, because a lot of the issues just overlap with faithful living in a culture of fear. So we'll sort of weave between some focus on parenting kinds of issues and also kind of generally thinking about how do we live well, how do we live as disciples in the midst of a culture where fear is both magnified and manipulated. And we need ways to examine that and become aware and also figure out how we resist as faithful people. The image that I have up here is a photo that was sent to me by my brother-in-law. He said to me in the email where he attached this photo, he said, "This is what my bedside table looked like one evening. I thought it was kind of funny, so I thought I'd send you a picture." So that's my book, by the way, Underneath the Gun. And I thought, well, at least my book is on the top of the pile, you know? So I thought that suggested maybe he was actually reading it, or maybe he just set it up. I'm not sure which. What I didn't do was to send him back a note saying, "Thank you, you just provided me my opening slide every time I talk about these things." But in a way, right, the question that I was trying to get at in that book, and the question we have to think about as Christians in a culture that can be captivated by fear, is in some ways a question of the gun at the bedside table. It's a question of where our security comes from. It's a question of whether we need the gun at the bedside table. And it's a question of, maybe more importantly, how do we see the world differently when the gun is at the bedside table? So all of those questions are sort of tied up in the question of fear and the question of how we as disciples of Jesus Christ think about addressing the fear that's in our lives and the fear that's in the world around us. When I talk about the culture of fear, I'm referring to things that are in fact very real and provoke very real fear, right? The Boston Marathon bombing recently, the Sandy Hook school shootings, economic crashes that many of us have lived through over the last few years and many people have yet to really pull out of. Issues like climate change. There are lots of things around us that provoke real fear. So my goal in this next hour is not to tell you there's nothing to be afraid of. The posture of a kind of naive assurance that just closes its eyes to the real things that are fearful in the world won't get us very far. So it's not that there's nothing to be afraid of in the world. The question is, how do we fear the right things to the right extent? Right? How do we fear the right things, and how do we fear them to the right extent? And part of the problem in a world where there are scary things that do, in fact, happen, part of the problem is the way those events get mediated to us. So, for instance, a lot of news media is going to draw on the most sensationalist, the most shocking stories. Nancy Grace, I don't know if you've had the joy of watching any of Nancy Grace's programming, right? But she's someone, she began as sort of a court reporter for CNN and expanded to get her own show because she's really good at being shocked and angry, right? And so she sort of mediates shock and anger at all sorts of different stories, and she tends to pick up on the stories that are most scandalous or most frightening. Right? And you can see from, this was just a screenshot off of her website, you can see the kinds of stories, right, that she follows. And the thing is, this is largely what happens with especially television news, and it's partly because with the advent of 24-hour news channels, some 20 years ago now, with the advent of 24-hour news channels, you actually have to fill up 24 hours worth of news. Right, so you're constantly trying to find something that can fill up the airspace, but you also need viewers because increasingly news programming was competing with all other kinds of programming. Right, news wasn't seen as a public service anymore. News is now just a program among others. It has to maximize profit. just like every other program. If it doesn't maximize profit, we might as well show other kinds of programming, right? Because we're not producing news to serve the public. We're producing news because it's a profitable enterprise. But then we have to keep asking, how do we keep it profitable? How do we keep viewers? Well, we do that by scaring them, right? Among other things. I remember one evening watching television, and there was a sort of teaser for the evening local news, and they said, why drinking too much water can kill you. Find out more tonight at 11. So I mean, of course, I stayed up and watched, right? I mean, I was sort of committed to that eight glasses a day thing, and I thought, oh my gosh, they're going to tell me this is killing me. So, right, it turns out it wasn't quite as scary as it sounded, right? But here's the thing, right? We see something like that, and you recognize, especially once you become attentive and attuned to these things, you recognize, yes, of course, right? If they can make me afraid, they get me to watch. If they get me to watch, they have more viewers, they can charge more for advertising, they maximize profit. So I become, right, the product that's getting sold. And they do that by making me afraid. So once we start becoming attentive to that, then we have different kind of eyes for noticing the way that fear gets played up, magnified, and sometimes manipulated. There are often diseases or viruses du jour that sort of arise and disappear. West Nile was a big one for a while. It disappeared, then it came back. Not to say that these viruses are not threatening, right? Because to a limited extent, they are in fact there and they are threatening. But they're not nearly as threatening statistically as we might think, because they get great news coverage, right? There's another bird flu now that we're worrying about over in China. And one of these flus kills 3 or 4 people, and suddenly it's all over the news. And you think, my gosh, 3 or 4 people? I mean, that's bad, but 3 or 4 people die on the highways, in a matter of a few hours. So part of it is putting this in perspective, trying to say, should I panic? Should I panic? And a lot of times we panic because these stories are distorted. You'll notice, for instance, on this screenshot, the future of West Nile virus. Right above it is the ad for pre-strike mosquito torpedo. Right? So there you go, right? We scare you with the news story, and then we present you with the product that's going to kill those darn mosquitoes, and you'll be safe. Right, so it's not an accident that this story and that ad end up on the website at the same moment. I should say that the church is not immune to using fear. This is a T-shirt I found online. This group that sells these Christian T-shirts. Every time you take a breath, 7 people go to hell. Don't be one of them. And then the logo down there, in case you can't tell, is Fear God. So it's a play on the no fear sort of extreme sportswear. But this is the Fear God line of products. Usually we're not quite as egregious as this, right? But the church has a history of knowing how to use fear to control people, direct people, sometimes even manipulate people. So we can't just point the finger out there. To some extent, we have to point it back at ourselves, because any organization, any institution is going to be tempted to use fear to reach our goals, right? We think we have some really good goals. If we can scare people enough, maybe we can get to those goals, right? Without realizing the way that the very means by which we try to reach those goals sometimes subvert the goals themselves. So what about specifically parenting? These are a couple of screenshots from the parenting section of the Today Show website. Beachbound, try these tips for a safer trip. We're going to the beach now, and it used to be, especially when I was a kid, you just go to the beach. You don't think about it, right? You're not worried about, how the sun is destroying your skin and how it's going to cause cancer later in life. You're not worried about, sharks in the waters. But now, right, you go to the beach, let's think about safety. Right? This is the first thing we need to think about. Don't think about fun, right? Think about how you can stay safe if you're beach bound. Or how about this? Are your kids okay at the playground? Right? Swings and slides are fun, but parents should check for hazards. So now I'm thinking, I've got 3 boys. They're now 13, 11, and 8. And so we don't take quite as many trips to the playground as we used to, though we still do some. But I can't imagine going to the playground with them and saying, all right, boys, here we are at the playground. Y'all just sit here, and I'm going to check for hazards, you know? That's not going to happen, right? And I'm going around, checking the slide for sharp edges or something. I don't know. But right, I mean, that's the message. That's the message we're getting. If you're a good parent, right, and that's the thing, right? That's where they get you. If you're a good parent, you'll be checking for those hazards. And then if your kid gets hurt at the playground, it's your fault, right? Because you didn't check for hazards. So we have these fears that move in, and they move in because we're trying to figure out how to be good parents, and this is how we're being told to be good parents. Are your children safe in their rooms? All right, so now we've gone from the beach to the playground to their rooms, right? That's not even safe. You can't send their kid to their room anymore, right? Because you're putting them in harm's way. Right, so parents who have raised kids in the last 10 years or so know about these little things, right? You got to be worried about the cords that hang down from your blinds, and so the remarkable thing is there always seems to be a product for sale, right? That's going to help you protect your home. So on the one hand, the fear comes in. If you're a good parent, you will do everything you can to keep your child safe. And I'm thinking, heck yeah, I want to be a good parent, right? And then here's a wall full of products you can now purchase, right? So it's build up the fear and then sell you the product. So I remember when our first son was born, we're baby-proofing the house, and you go around and you're trying to cover every corner. They got these little pads, right? You cover every corner of the sharp coffee table edge. And I remember getting a toilet lock, right? Because, there it was, there it was in the midst of all the good baby-proofing stuff, right? Toilet locks, oh, of course, my guys, they can fall in, it's terrible. So I'm trying to hook this toilet lock onto our toilet, and I can't get it, right? I can't get it to work, and it won't stay in place. And all the while, as I'm trying to do this, I'm thinking, I really hope I don't have to get up in the middle of the night, right? And come in here in the dark and try to get this thing off because I can't even get it on. I don't know how I'm going to get it off. Eventually, I gave up on the toilet lock, and it turned out things were fine. But this is part of how it works, right? There's a whole big marketing agenda around safe parenting. One of my friends teaches young adult literature. She's an English professor, and one of her classes is children's and young adult literature. And one of the stories they read is this, when Sophie gets angry, really, really angry. It's a great kind of classic children's story. And it's about Sophie, and she gets angry, and what she does is she goes out into nature, right? She goes out into the woods, and she climbs trees, and she looks at the sky, and she sees the water, and she calms down, right? Her anger begins to dissipate as she goes out and just engages the natural world, and then she comes home, right? She feels better. So this friend of mine who teaches this as part of her class said, over the last few years, an interesting trend has emerged. That is, her students' responses, so she's teaching undergraduates, so these are kids who have, they're 18 to 22-year-olds. She said that the reaction that she gets most often from reading this book, and usually the first reaction is, we should not read this book to children. And the reason we shouldn't read this book to children is that children should not think it's safe to wander off into the woods by themselves. This is bad parenting. Those parents should never have let Sophie out of the house by herself. So Sophie doesn't get to run off into the woods and climb trees and experience nature and calm herself down and come home because that's unsafe territory now, and that's bad parenting. And these are young people. These aren't folks who have their kids yet, right? They're folks who have grown up with this message, right? It's not because their parents worried about, that these kids are parents worried about their children. It's that this is the message they got as kids. And it's quite different from when I was growing up, when you take off and you get on your bike, you start riding the neighborhood, and you say, I'll be back at dinner. And, and dinner means when it's too dark for me to see where to go on my bike next, right? And that's it. And Mom says, see ya, and we go. And you play, and she doesn't really know where we are, but we're somewhere in the neighborhood, right? And then we come back. And that was a world in which there was a kind of freedom, a sort of movement, a way that kids could go out and explore. And now the problem is parents who want to be good parents figure if I let my kids do that, I'm not a good parent, right? The whole thing has gotten reversed. And so there are all sorts of ways in which fear enters into our parenting in some pretty problematic kind of ways. So I want to say just a word about fear itself and how fear goes bad. Because I mentioned before, it's not that there's nothing to be afraid of, right? It's not that bad things never happen or that we should close our eyes to that. In fact, bad things do happen. We need to be aware of it. We need to have the right amount of fear to make good, wise judgments. Right? So it's not that fearlessness is the goal, because that's generally that's purchased at the price of closing our eyes to the world. Okay, so having said that, though, the real problem is when fear is disordered, it's disproportional, we're fearing things that really aren't that dangerous or maybe not dangerous at all. So fear gets disordered, and when it gets disordered, this is when it becomes a problem for us. And one way it gets disordered is we fear the wrong things. Another way that it gets disordered is we fear the right things, but we fear them too much. Right? We fear them in a way that's way disproportionate to the actual threat, which means that fear then starts to grip us. It starts to over-determine our actions and our responses. And disordered fear then leads to what I call an ethic of security. Right, where our fundamental posture toward the world is, how can I or my kids stay safe? Right? How can we keep ourselves safe? Everything else has to serve that goal. Right? There's a proper place for asking questions about staying safe. But when we follow a God who has come to us in Christ and said, take up your cross and follow me, there's also a place to say safety isn't our highest good. It's important. We attend to it, but there are some things that are more important. This is why we celebrate the martyrs in the church, right? That's why so many of our saints' days have to do with people who knew that there was something more important than just staying alive. Bearing witness to the goodness of God in this world, right? Loving this world well, living well, all of those things are our highest calling. Right? When someone asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love God and love your neighbor. This is the highest calling. Seek first the kingdom of God. All these other things will be added to you as well. The highest calling is love God, love your neighbor, seek the kingdom of God. God will add on to you all the things you need in terms of security, right? But when we flip those and we say, I want security at all costs, and maybe that means I can't really love God or my neighbor, right? Or maybe that means I can't really seek the kingdom of God first because I'm more concerned about being safe, right? Then our priorities get mixed up, right? And our responses, our reactions in the world get driven by fear. And then we're no longer a faithful people bearing witness to the God of Jesus Christ. We have just become people who want to save our skin. And so this feeds into how we think about being parents. Lacking any consensus about good parenting, we take refuge in safe parenting. This is one of the things that I think has happened over the last, say, 40, 50 years. A cultural consensus about what good parenting looks like has broken down. It's disappeared. When my wife and I were having kids, it wasn't enough for us to just ask our moms about how to raise children. You know, nah, come on, you can't do that. You have to read the experts. You know, you have to get, for one generation it was Dr. Spock, and then it was Dr. Sears, and I don't know, there's probably somebody new now. Right? There's the expert who's going to tell you how to raise kids, and don't trust the wisdom handed down from your elders. You got to get the expert advice. And the problem then is you start reading the experts, and they all say different things. Right? And so the consensus about what it looks like to be a good parent breaks down. And lacking any cultural consensus around that, we take refuge in saying, well, at least we can be safe parents, right? I don't know what it looks like to be a good parent, but I know what it looks like to be safe, right? And there's a whole shelf full of products that'll help me do it. And so I think that's part of why safe parenting has become the dominant discourse within a lot of parenting talk, a lot of parenting books, a lot of parenting training. It's about how you stay safe. And so we've lost that sense that good parenting is about raising kids who themselves can embrace this wonderful life that they have been given, who can move out joyfully into the world, who can bear witness to the God who made them. Right? Yeah, but let's make sure they're safe first. Right? We avoid risk, and as we avoid risk, we discourage courage. It becomes very difficult to raise courageous children, right? Because what we've taught them all along the way is don't do risky things. But courage requires that we sometimes do risky things, right? In pop culture, there have been a number of kids' movies that have addressed this kind of theme, and one of the first was Finding Nemo. More recently, Hotel Transylvania, The Cruise, if any of you have seen these films, right? They're addressing that issue of parental fear and the ways that the fear of parents constrain the lives of their kids. But Finding Nemo was kind of the first and classic. And it does it so well. And you'll remember Marlin, the Nemo's dad, the clownfish, loses his wife and almost their entire, all of the eggs that she has laid. Only one egg remains, right? And they lose it to this shark attack. And so Marlin has become this very fearful parent because all he's got left is little Nemo, right? That one egg that wasn't eaten up by the shark. And so Marlin, the fearful parent, is now going to do everything he can to protect Nemo. And of course what happens is Nemo gets lost, right? So now Marlin's worst fear has been realized. And Marlin, along the way, then trying to find Nemo, connects with Dory. So Marlin and Dory, the clownfish and the blue fish that has a name that I can't remember, they go after Nemo, right? And there's one point at which Marlin says to Dory, I made a promise to Nemo that I would never let anything happen to him. And Dory says, huh, that's a funny promise to make. I mean, if nothing ever happens to him, then nothing's ever going to happen to him. That's not much fun for little Nemo. And there's that moment when Marlin has to face what he had become as a parent, right? His only goal was nothing happens to Nemo, which means nothing ever happens in Nemo's life, right? Putting your kids in a padded room might keep them really safe, right? But it's not going to give them much of a life. So we have to figure out how do we open up the way beyond just questions of safety and security to embrace the joy that can come from adventure, that can come from exploration. Fear-based parenting tends to make us cautious, tends to make us reactive, risk-avoiding, inhospitable, and too busy avoiding dangers to welcome adventures. That's not what we want to be, right? But sometimes it's what we become, and we become that precisely because we think we're being good parents. So how do we resist that, right? How do we push against that a bit? How do we find antidotes to fear? And specifically within the context of our faith, how do we find antidotes that can help us address fear differently in our own lives so that we can also address fear differently in relation to our children or the children of the church and the younger generations who we're all involved in forming? And I want to just talk briefly about three things. One is trusting providence, one is building community, and the other is taking risks. Trusting providence is a tricky matter. Providence is one of those doctrines that in the early church and up all the way through the Middle Ages, providence is a pretty dominant doctrine. And so as you read the church theologians, they talk a lot about providence, and usually what they mean is something like we can trust God for everything that happens in our lives, and if good things happen, it's because God is blessing us, and if bad things happen, it's because God is either punishing or testing us. As we moved into modernity, as we saw shifts that occurred in the 16th and 17th centuries, and we moved up into the present, a few things happened. One of the things that happened is we were actually able to produce scientific descriptions of a lot of things that happen in the world so that we didn't have to imagine that whenever something odd happens, it must be God directly intervening in history, right? So we know thunder and lightning is not Zeus casting down thunderbolts, right? We know they're actually some explanations for that. Doesn't mean we don't believe in God. It just means we have some other explanations for how natural stuff happens in the world. Right? So we have some other ways of narrating historical movements and narrating the natural world. But I think more significantly, we started asking questions about where this leaves us if our only options in thinking about providence is if a good thing happens, God is blessing you. If a bad thing happens, God is punishing or testing you. And if you go all the way back into the book of Job, right, they were asking these same questions. And it's not as if these are radically new questions. The book of Job is asking exactly those questions. And the friends of Job who are trying to explain his suffering to him say, well, you're suffering because either you sinned or you sinned. I mean, they were pretty sure that it must be a punishment, right? I mean, there weren't really many other options. And the thing was, we know as readers of the story from the very beginning, Job was a righteous man. It wasn't his sin. Right? So there are places where we're already struggling with this within the biblical text itself. As we moved into modernity, then we started feeling like, if we lay every bad thing at God's feet, we end up with a pretty messed up account of God. Right? If I have to say every bad thing that happens in the world is somehow exactly what God wants to have happen, right? For a lot of people, the Holocaust sort of constitutes a moment. But you could pick lots of others. But that's just one that folks look at and say, how could I possibly say God was behind this? Really? That's a punishment? Could anybody possibly deserve that? Right? So it's led us to think differently about providence, but what's tended to happen for a lot of folks in churches and a lot of theologians and a lot of pastors, priests, and preachers is we just don't talk about it. Right, we just don't talk about it. Because we don't quite know how to say we can trust God with our future and at the same time recognize that's not a guarantee, right? That's not a cover-all insurance policy that says you're good, nothing's ever going to happen to you. So how do we make sense of providence? Well, one of the ways I think we do it is we think of God not as pushing history from behind, right? Causing everything to happen as a kind of force that makes things occur as they do, but rather God who pulls history forward toward the good ends that God has in store for us, right? So I think this is what Paul means in Romans 8:28 when he says that all things work for good for those who are called by God and who are those who are loved by God and called according to his purposes. All things work for good. And it doesn't say God causes all things to happen, right? Hey, let me see, if I do this really awful thing here, then maybe something good could come out of it. Instead, what it says is when the awful things happen, and they sometimes will, because we are finite creatures, we live in a vulnerable world, and we are prone to sin. So bad things are going to happen. But when they do, God draws from it the possibility that we can still be moving toward our good end. The story of Joseph is a great example of that in the book of Genesis, right? His brothers sell him into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. He ends up in prison. It all looks terrible for Joseph, right? It's the work of his brothers. The text doesn't say God told his brothers to sell him into slavery, right? The brothers are clearly doing something they shouldn't do. But by the time we get to the end of the story, Joseph has stored up food enough that the people of Israel can come down to Egypt during the famine and be saved. They can find food. Joseph was exactly where he needed to be in order to prepare the way for Israel to survive the famine that was coming. And at the end, Joseph says to his brothers, what you intended for harm, God intended for good. Right? Which again doesn't mean God thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun if I make Joseph really suffer, right? And then maybe something good can come. It's more that God says, given what his brothers are doing to him, how can I move this story to a place where goodness still triumphs, right? And we see it happen. And we see Joseph recognizing that at the end of the story in a way he probably couldn't have recognized it when he was in prison in Egypt, right? But by the end of the story, he can look back and see God's hand at work. So God doesn't push history, but pulls history forward. God doesn't simply prevent bad things from happening, right? I mean, reading Scripture, we see that right from the start. God doesn't prevent Adam and Eve from eating of the tree, even though God's told them not to. But what God does is provides for us when those bad things happen, right? Provision is at the heart of providence. Another way of putting it is that God is not controlling but redeeming history. God is not micromanaging every bit of history so that we're just sort of puppets that God's moving around, right? God has given us real freedom to act in this world and for our actions to have significance. But in order for our actions to have significance, then God has to let go enough for us to be able to act. And so God's not micromanaging and controlling everything, but God is in the work of redeeming things when things are lost along the way. So the way I like to think about this is that if we were the kind of Christians who were prone to putting our theology on bumper stickers and putting it on our cars, then our bumper stickers could look like this, right? And the thing is, I've never actually seen both of these bumper stickers on the same car. But I think you could put both of these bumper stickers on the same car, right? And so there's the short version of what I'm trying to say here about Providence. That these, that's right. Right? When stuff happens in our lives, God is still there as our co-pilot. Right? And these two things can coexist. And so the last thing I guess to leave you with this notion of providence is that trusting in providence, trusting God's provision, has to do with our ability to say and. When we think about the worst thing that might happen, we then can add and to the end of that sentence. Right? So in the life of the church, we think about, oh, what if we don't have enough money to make our budget, or what if we have problems with the building, or what if we call a new priest and then he or she doesn't work out? And so we have these things that we fear, right, and we worry about. And one way of trusting providence is just to say, and so what happens then? Because the thing is, part of our problem with fear is that we imagine a point at which a bad thing happens and the story just ends, right? But this isn't how God's story goes, right? Cross is followed by resurrection. So part of how we resist being stuck in that place of fear is to be able to say, I can imagine those things I'm afraid of, and even if they happen, there's the and, right? There's the way in which God is going to carry this story forward, because God is a God not only who provides for us in the midst of those difficult times, but who redeems what is lost along the way, ultimately whose redemption is resurrection. So we trust providence. We learn to reclaim the significance of trusting in God's care, not in a naive way, right, but in a way that allows us to have some sense of comfort in the midst of a world where there's turmoil. So what else? We trust providence and we build community. We build community in our families. We build community in our church. And hopefully we're building community even beyond that in our neighborhoods and in our city. Community is an antidote to fear, because fear breeds on isolation. It breeds on that sense of being cut off and alienated. So building community is a way of giving one another the support we need precisely by saying, we are there for you if that thing you fear actually happens, right? We give one another strength, we give one another courage to push up against those things we're afraid of, because we have a whole community of people who are going to stand by us, right? Or we give our kids the ability to push forward into risky things, right? To try a new activity, to go out there and try to play soccer, go out there and try to take up an instrument, go out there and try to ask out that boy or that girl, right? The things that we watch our kids be afraid of, and the risks they're not necessarily wanting to take because they're afraid of rejection, they're afraid of failure. And part of how we help them move out into those risks is to say, we are here, right? We've built a family around you, we've built a church family around you, such that you know if things don't go well in this, you're not by yourself, right? You got all of us to fall back on. And so we give one another the courage to go out, to take risks, to do good things, to undertake adventures, because we know that we have others who bear those risks alongside of us. But it's also true that community can sometimes reinforce our fear. So we have to be careful about the kind of community that we create. Sometimes we create community out of our shared fearfulness, right? One way of creating community is to say, we all come together around some sense of our sameness, some sense of comfort that everyone's kind of like me here. And the community comes from saying we share common enemies, or we exclude certain kinds of people together, and that helps us be bound up close to one another because we're not them, right? That's one way community gets formed. It's a distorted kind of community, at least in terms of our Christian faith, right? But that's one of the ways community, so we have to be careful because the language of community just sounds so good, right? Everybody wants community. But we have to think about, what am I basing the community on? What am I basing the community of the church? Or how am I describing to my kids the way that we have a community as a family? Is it because we pull in tightly and we circle the wagons, right? To keep them out, to stay safe from that threat or that harm? Because if we do that, then we undermine the way that the community can open us and free us. Right? So the opposite of a fear-driven community would be a kind of hope-centered community, right? Where because we have gathered around one another, we have this ability to take risks, to go off into adventurous things, to live life as disciples, to take up the challenges that God places upon us when God calls us and God sends us. So we trust Providence, we build community, and finally we learn to be a people who take risks. There's some wonderful children's literature and young adult literature that deals with risk and risk-taking, and the Harry Potter series is certainly one of them. Alan Jacobs, who writes for Christianity Today and another publication called Books and Culture, he's an English professor at Wheaton College and a really insightful reader of texts. He says this about Harry Potter. He says, the key theme of the whole series is the opposition of death and love. The devastation wrought by those whose fear of death causes them to shun love as a weakness, and in contrast, the rich rewards in store for those who will not allow the fear of death to block love, who know that love risks all for the beloved. Right? I mean, if you've read the Harry Potter books at all, you'll know that what Voldemort, the evil character, is after is immortality. Right? He's driven by a fear of death. Right? So he wants to do awful acts that will split his soul, right? He does things that are so bad, they split his soul, but he does it on purpose because he wants his soul to split so that he can hide pieces of his soul around, and then if any bit of his soul gets destroyed, there's more of him somewhere else, right? There's this strange sort of perverse thing going on where he's so afraid of fear. He's so afraid of death that he will do horrible things. He will even shatter his own soul in order to keep some piece of himself alive. And the opposite of that is this little band of teenage kids who are trying to figure out, right, with the guidance of Dumbledore and others, right, what it means to press on into a world of love. Jacobs also says this about the Potter series, about why he thinks it has become so popular. He said, I think one of the reasons people find this world of Harry Potter so fascinating, our culture is so deeply risk-averse, so determined to punish anyone who might cause injury to us or our children, or even might fail to take precautions to prevent us from being injured, that we can scarcely imagine an environment in which risk is so blithely accepted and injuries dealt with so matter-of-factly. But it is just because Hogwarts is a place which allows young people to take such risks, and therefore to test themselves and grow in a capability and confidence, that its students and graduates love it so much. Right? It gives, and so no wonder kids are flocking to these books, right? They're reading about a world in which love and risk actually are at the center of things. And it's attractive, right? Because they're surrounded by a world that tells them, don't take risks, play it safe. If love becomes risky, just back off. There's nothing compelling about that story, right? But this gives them a compelling story about love overcoming fear and death. One of the other stories I love that deals with this are the Chronicles of Narnia. In the first book of the Chronicles, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis has this moment where the four Pevensey children have all come into this magical world of Narnia, where we have talking animals, among other things, and we have Aslan, the Christ figure, So he's imaged as a lion in the stories, which you probably have all either read or seen the movies. But so the children are there, and they're talking to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. And there's this moment in the story where Mr. and Mrs. Beaver are telling them about why it's been winter in Narnia for so long, and Aslan hasn't been around, and the White Witch has taken over. But they're hopeful that Aslan will return. And at a certain point, Susan, I believe it is, says, "Oh, wait a minute. I thought you were talking about a man. You mean Aslan is a lion?" And her next question is he quite safe? Is he quite safe? And I want to read to you a bit of the beaver's response. Right? She says, Susan says, "Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "That you will, dearie, and no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly." "Then he isn't safe?" said Lucy. "Safe," said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good." Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. Right? And this is how Lewis is trying to depict the Christ figure of the story, trying to reveal to us something about the God who calls us to follow. God's not calling us into safety, but God is always calling us from a place of goodness and calling us into goodness. So what do I hope for? What do I trust in? I don't trust that Aslan is safe. I trust that Aslan is good, which means the risks that I take along the way will always be worth it. And that's our antidote to fear, right? That's how we keep fear from controlling and over-determining our lives. I'm going to stop now because we've only got a couple minutes left. But in those couple of minutes, I think there may be time for one or two questions or comments. So if you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, feel free to.
I just kept thinking as you were talking, because our children are probably your age. And they had a life like you did, living in the middle of the city, having bicycles stolen out from under them, other people. But I keep thinking about what I've seen helicopter parents.
Yeah.
Kids after our children grew up, and how they just kept everything so safe. And we built community, of course, in this church. I mean, I have to thank him for saving one of mine more than once. But also within the parents, too. I mean, we knew where our kids were. We talked to each other. If they said they were spending the night somewhere, we called.
Right.
But we let them know.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that phenomenon of the helicopter parent is totally tied in with this culture of fear, right? We because it's partly to keep them safe, but helicopter parenting is also about not just our fear for their physical safety, but our fear for their future, right? We want to make sure they are going to
make us look good.
Well, yeah, I was trying to think of a nicer way to put it, right? But yeah, right. Right. We're going to keep them on task so that they succeed, right? Because
Look like good parents.
because then we look like good parents. Yeah.
Fear of safety is one thing. Fear of suffering, sometimes we seek to prevent not suffer ourselves or children.
Yeah. And again, that's the place where we have to understand how do I strike that right balance? Where of course I don't want my children to suffer, but I also, over the course of their growing up, I want to teach them there are some things worth suffering for. And how do I teach them that without, while at the same time trying to be attentive that I don't want suffering to come upon them, right? But I also don't want them to think that suffering is the worst thing that could ever happen. And that we avoid it at all costs. Because sometimes the really good things we pursue involve some forms of suffering or sacrifice to get there. Yeah, please.
There was an interesting story circulating during Lent and Easter that I thought underscores exactly how much children do pay attention to our own fear. There was a priest that was giving, in the middle of his service, was giving a section of it to the children. And was talking to the children, and he was talking about the resurrection and so forth. And he turned to the children and said, well, what do you all think about the resurrection? This little boy raised his hand. He said, well, I understand that if your resurrections last more than 4 hours, you have to seek medical help.
Let's go to church.
Thank you, Wen. Thank you all.